everyone. Please do make your way back to the main event space. We're kicking off the next session very, very soon. Hope you enjoyed lunch. There's still a lot of food left over, so what you could do is grab a plate, put some food, and then come back to the main space. Hi everyone, please make your way back to the space. We're just about to kick off. Hi all, we're just about to close this door, so please do make your way out so that you don't get stuck. All right, team, please make your way back. We're just starting. All right, I think we've got most people back from lunch, which is fantastic. Hope you enjoyed the food. Have you ever had India at a legal conference before? Other than the conference last year, obviously. Excellent. So tomorrow is Mexican, so do come back for the food, if not for the content or for me. So before we begin the afternoon session, and by the way, do stick around because we've got an after party. We've got lots of amazing sessions. We've got drinks coming out early. I know you guys need booze, especially Connor. I can see you looking for a drink. So yeah, do stick around. But before we do, I think we've got a video from one of our sponsors, Contract Pod AI. So man, if you could take us away.
Your company has a legal team, a sales and procurement team, we need to get this done yesterday team. This isn't the time for outdated workflows because you're running at the speed of business. That's why there's Contract Pod AI Cloud, powered by the most intuitive AI engine on the planet. Quickly and easily create, complete, search, and manage contracts of any type, while advanced AI automatically detects and extracts obligations and offers recommendations that help you make decisions fast. Legal readiness is business readiness. Get ready.
Excellent. So do reach out to the Contract Pod AI team. They've got a table just in the lunchroom over there, the chat room. We've also got obviously our other sponsors. We've got tables, so please do speak to them. And before we begin the next panel, the question was, yes, the Aspen Legal Ninja Night. It's right here, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. We've got drinks and we've got a lot of fun music. So please do stick around. So why should you come back for day 2? Because, you know, a lot of people were saying to me, they're like, oh, a lot of people will come on Thursday, but very few people will come on the Friday. Like, why are you even doing a 2-day summit? Well, actually, I've been getting a lot of messages from people today saying, hey, I'm not coming on the Thursday, I'm actually coming on the Friday. So I think there's going to be a bigger turnout tomorrow. And obviously, we've also got some amazing sessions with speakers from American Express, Visa, WeWork, and many amazing organizations. So do come back, or you can watch the live stream. And without further ado, our next panel. It's called How to Develop a Robust Data Privacy and Data Protection Strategy. Our moderator is Alfredo Amado, Head of Legal and Company Secretary at Annalise AI. Our panelists are Alejandro Arvelo, Managing Counsel and Company Secretary at Fiserv. Fleur Katz-Martin, Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Jamie Alvarado, Legal Counsel at the Collective Wellness Group. And Roxanne Kunmaker tonight. So yeah, please do welcome our speakers to the stage. Excellent. So before I hand over to Alfredo, I was just going to say, save up your questions. We'll ask some questions at the midpoint and at the end of our panelists. But how many of you in your jobs deal with like data privacy, data protection stuff? Okay, good. This is going to be useful then. Alfredo, over to you. Alfredo, you just have to take it off with you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for allowing us to be here today to talk to you about how you can develop a robust data privacy and data protection strategy. Now, I hope you all had an opportunity to have a look at the privacy policy that I put up out the front earlier today. It's not approved by Law Ninjas, but in full transparency of the use of your data, I will say that if anyone exits our discussion or looks even partly disinterested, I will be transferring your details to the call center that keeps calling me, offering me really hot deals on solar panels and battery packs. Okay, everyone's really interested now. That's great. All right, in all seriousness, data strategies, no matter what company you work for today, it's one of the hottest topics, and it comes up in all areas of your business. And particularly, we're obviously working against a very interesting framework today, where we've got changes in our Privacy Act that are eventually going to come out at some point. And obviously, we've got some really interesting enforcement action happening against Medibank that's in the theoretical trillions of dollars. So it's quite an interesting time to be practicing in the data space. Now, obviously, topic that's garnering a lot of attention, and it just so happens that we've got a really incredible panel here today to talk through some of the issues that we're all facing in data privacy. So let's get started. Now, when we think about data privacy and data protection, you know, the usual things come up as lawyers. We're always thinking about, you know, some of the fundamentals, data mapping, data frameworks, privacy policies, hopefully not as invisible as the one that I had out the front, audits, etc. And so you have to start somewhere. So on that, I might start with Flo. If I could take your mind back to the day one of your current organisation, and now with the benefit of hindsight, where do you think you'd start developing your data strategy, and why start there?
Good question. I'm going to start with a disclaimer that everything I talk about today is in the hypothetical. None of this is real. The Royal Melbourne Hospital is Victoria's oldest hospital. We're 176 years old, which is exciting. Go us. So when I started at RMH in 2021, about 10 months earlier, where the organisation had rolled out an electronic medical record with a number of other hospitals in the state. Lo and behold, it's hard to believe that probably 172 years of the organisation, they were relying on paper for data governance. And really in the last 4 years, we've kind of moved into the new world using an electronic medical record, which is very exciting, but obviously comes with its challenges. So I came in 10 months in, everyone was very excited about it. But it did come with its challenges. So, I think one of the key points of what made it effective was that this was an executive mandate. We're a public hospital. The department, the government was very keen for us to do this, always helps. And the executive sponsor was the CEO. So, the CEO was ingrained into rolling this out in the midst of COVID, because obviously in Victoria in public health we had nothing to do during COVID. So it made for plenty of time to put everything into an electronic space. But the executive sponsor was critical. Some of the things that worked really well was we had data stewards at every level across the organisation, including myself as the ethics and compliance data steward. This becomes critical because it's great to have a system, but if you're not getting buy-in from the people who are using the system, it doesn't really matter. We went from a situation where people were using paper forms in the hospital or fax machines. People get very attached to their fax machines. This is still an ongoing issue, hypothetically, of course. To move from this and some systems that different areas of the organisation were using themselves to roll in a system where you had, about 11,000 employees in a big bang using an electronic medical record. So data stewards from the clinical levels to HR to finance, this was really critical to ensure that you had buy-in from people who were required to use it every day. Things that could have worked better, hypothetically, when we put together the data governance framework in anticipation of the new EMR, you consider the data life cycle, and data destruction is something which I know, a number of us, and I know Ivana kind of stole our thunder earlier, but was talking about, the criticality of these sorts of things. Data destruction is probably something we're still struggling with. We have 176 years worth of data, not all, but a lot of it, and it's, no one wants to destroy anything. But as you move into a space which is highly regulated, and we're dealing with extremely sensitive information, and we're dealing with hypothetical data breaches, it's all about how do we now work through that data life cycle effectively. So I'll just leave it at that one.
That's really insightful. We had a very similar issue in terms of data destruction and in a hypothetical scenario as well. There were instances where you'd spend tons and tons of money developing product, and then there was just a slight failure in considering, okay, what does the law say about data destruction and soon to be the right to be forgotten, etc. And then you have to tell some poor engineers that they have to go and redevelop their product. It's not a fun time, that's for sure. Jamie, maybe turning to you really quickly here. Can you talk us through maybe some of the challenges that you face in developing and implementing your own data strategies where you are now, or perhaps where you were before?
Yeah, sure. So Collective Wellness Group is the parent company for Anytime Fitness Australia. So being a fitness franchisor with, a franchising network of, in excess of 560 units is a challenge to manage in itself. Implementing our strategy in terms of how it's had an impact, practically speaking, is, almost reverse engineering how our franchisees have been operating since they entered the network. Most of them of which have been there with a tenure of 10 to 15 years now. So when we're suddenly saying, okay, you must ensure that you are no longer collecting personal information and retaining that, that raises alarm bells for them, understandably so. But I think bringing them on the journey and educating them as to why, and rationalising, why we need to change the way that we're currently managing personal and sensitive information, particularly particular, and how it's to their own benefit, and the potential recourse of that has equally been rewarding. So I'm very much a glass half full type of person. Whilst it's been challenging, I think it's also been incredibly rewarding to see that our franchisees are now starting to really adapt and coming back with more constructive feedback in terms of, well, can I possibly, adopt the strategy but do it in this manner, and would that still ensure compliance, because we've obviously got that competing privacy concern as well.
Yeah. I wonder if Alex shares the same half glass full thoughts.
So, I do. Now, for us at Fiserv, so we're a very large payments organisation, and technology is sort of the backbone in providing the market offering. So it underpins everything we basically do. So there is a lot of ones and zeros in a lot of platforms that we have across the world. The challenges that I see, that I've had in doing this job, is basically, it's the ideology of having this fantastic data strategy that we have, and in theory, in your mind, you think it's just going to play out and it's going to work and everyone's going to adhere to it. But then that's an expectation of having everyone to understand what the Privacy Act is, having everyone reading your data strategy and what we call our collection statement, which is not reasonable. So I find the biggest challenge for me is the gap between what we have as a sort of a leadership team and a governance team and what the engineers perhaps sort of understand and do. And you can't expect them to sort of really understand privacy law. So the solutions that we've implemented, me personally, in order to sort of mitigate that or sort of manage that gap, which I think is sort of inevitable with most organisations, you're going to have that gap, is education and training. So I run an alignment series every sort of couple of months. It's basically a workshop, and I invite sort of everyone to come along and we just discuss in an open forum privacy. And I think that helps with that alignment between sort of business and my department. We talk the privacy data stewards that Fleur talks about. I think is a great idea, one that I might even implement myself. I think because I feel like with us, that's the main challenge. A lot of the data is transactional data, it's cardholder data, and so the engineers are working every day on programs and using that data in different ways in order to police it and ensure that it's done correctly is probably one of the biggest challenges that I find, yeah.
That's certainly had very similar issues pop up and challenges. One document that I recall I thought everyone obviously read was a data breach response plan. I thought surely everyone in this company knows about it. I developed a whole training model on it. It's an onboarding for it. It's max 2 pages. Can't be that difficult. And every good data strategy obviously needs to have at least a data breach response plan. Anyway, I realised that not very many people read the thing, to my surprise. After I got a draft incident response form and a very eager engineer saying, look, I'm ready to contact the OAIC for you, just to let them know about the data breach. Okay. Yeah, I sent this email and I really shouldn't have sent the email to someone that I didn't want to send it to. Anyway, I think I called them and I'm on hold for a little bit. I said, how about you just come off of hold? We'll talk about this a little bit more. So that's just one instance of something that you try to implement. You think that everybody reads the things that you put out there. But Fleur, I'm sure you've got some very interesting stories that are on a similar path to that.
Obviously hypothetical.
Yeah, of course.
So, as a public hospital, people come to us not for a good time, unfortunately, but usually because there's something wrong, extremely vulnerable, and we deal with extremely sensitive information. So, trust in the organisation is critical. It's one of the reasons why we went down the data steward path, because you kind of want people to understand that they've got skin in the game for the data they deal with. Having said that, hypothetically, our data breach response plan continues to evolve, and that's intentional, because it's very good to have something on 2 pieces of paper. But each time we hypothetically have an incident, we take stock, we do the lessons learned, and we really ingest what was there, what did we miss, and what could we have done better. So instances like, for example, hypothetically, clinicians who store all their medical records in their email for the last 20 years because they haven't really come on board the EMR journey, who click on phishing emails. We're talking about that before. So training is critical, but people still do it, and the schemes and the hackers are there getting so much more sophisticated. So I think one of the things we've learned is to not underestimate the time and effort it takes to review something which seems very small. So you may think, one clinician's inbox could be very small, not a big issue, and then you're looking at, 40, 50,000 emails over a period of time, a lot of them with lots of different sorts of information. So the analysis takes a lot of people power. There are a lot of tools out there to help with that, but end of the day, for you to be comfortable, be able to brief the executive and the board, you need to know what's in there. I think that's probably one of the critical things. I think the other thing that we've learnt is managing stakeholder expectations. So I appreciate, from a compliance perspective, there are timeframes to notify, but you really want to be sure before you notify and start notifying people about this, that you know what you're notifying them about and that you're clear on what's happened. We've had this the other way around, where we've been notified, hypothetically, of breaches, from a research partner that basically, a large organisation that basically notified us as soon as they found out that there was something, with RMH letterhead in an email, but then couldn't tell us what the data was, couldn't tell us any information about it, and then wouldn't respond to our questions. So then we're left in a position of what's the data breach there? So I think, going back to what I was saying about public trust, there is, and someone mentioned in one of the earlier sessions about this panic of letting people know as soon as possible something's happened, but there is risk with that, especially if you don't know the information in detail.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So how do you deal with the eager beavers that are on hold to the OAIC? Do you
put the phone down?
Do you have an internal governance structure in RMH that helps you deal with who is the person that's responsible
Yes.
for talking through?
And that's become important too, and not everyone reaches the data response plan, reads it, but they know who to call. It's like, who do you call when the shit hits the fan? Who's the first? And similar to what was being said earlier, call the lawyer, call the privacy officer, call your key executive who has read the plan and knows what to do, and then we'll establish, the hospital incident management team to pull it together and work through it.
I think that's key. Knowing who to call at least is probably one of the best things to have in place, despite whatever data you process. So anyway, I was fortunate to get the call before it went anywhere else. And often, the data you can control is obviously, it's more ideal to know the type of data you control and control your own strategy, but oftentimes there are third parties that we can't control, and we don't know how what their governance structure is like, nor do we know how proficient they are in controlling the data that we provide to them. So I know that part of any good data strategy requires some thought to third parties as well. Jamie, if I could maybe focus on you real quickly here. In your data strategy, do you include anything that has some thinking towards how you manage third parties and the data that they process on your behalf?
Yes, absolutely. There's definitely been some learnings that we've actually implemented even from an onboarding stage now. So setting the expectation around, just disclosing what sort of data they will be collecting, accessing as part of their service they're providing, and also ensuring that they actually have a dedicated person responsible for information security and privacy is also equally important, and making sure that they adopt security policies that are based on recognised standards. I have to say the challenges, it hasn't particularly been a challenge from a newly appointed onboarded vendor, but for the existing group, that's definitely been challenging. There's obviously that change management piece of, there's a certain reporting cadence in place, and we're now changing the goalposts, and you now need to inform us of what your governance looks like from a privacy perspective. And very quickly, I think the response, it's not relative to me because I actually don't retain any of that data. I might hold it for about 12 months, but that's about it. There's no risk there. I say, well, no, there absolutely is risk there, and just also educating them on what the recourse of that looks like and their potential impact to the brand as well. So yeah, it's definitely been a journey with our vendors and something that we're continuously looking to work through with them.
And I mean, that's really interesting. That's the approach, effectively, what B2C. I know Alejandra is more B2B. Interested to hear as well your thoughts on how you manage third parties upstream, downstream.
With great difficulty is the short answer. So for us, yes, it's B2B. So if you think about it, it's a sort of a chain of entities sort of all working together, sort of providing a sort of a market offering to the ultimately is the consumer, which is the card holder. So if you like to think of the card holder who's got a credit card issued to them by a financial institution, that financial institution has services providing it to it, like us, and then we have licenses that we sort of use from other entities who have vendors behind them. So there is basically 4 or 5 different entities of where the data will travel to and from in order to sort of close or settle one transaction. And you're not talking entities that are all in Australia, of course. You might be talking 3 or different types of jurisdictions with different types of approaches to privacy and different types of approaches to data. So it's difficult to navigate, especially in my world. I mean, the way I basically sort of try and control it, I use that word control, but it's probably the wrong word to use, but it's basically, and with the new legislation that might get introduced, may assist this with some of the clauses that are looking to mandate. But you have to ensure basically that upstream and downstream have similar sort of privacy strategies as you do, and that you're all aligned and on the same page as to what's being offered and what it is you're doing. Because someone in India, who we use and utilize quite often, we have a big organization in India, may not necessarily perhaps understand or know what the privacy law in Australia is and what sort of things that they need to be doing or not doing. So it's an alignment with them. People in the US, people in the UK, similarly. So I heavily rely on audit rights. My audit rights are basically my insurance, and so I invoke them and I use them to give me peace of mind. It's probably have my compliance hat on, but give me peace of mind at least that there is some stage or some things being done to assure me or us that there are people out there that our vendors are adhering to our strategy. It's a saying, I thought about this this morning, and there's a saying one of my mentors gave me or told me a few years back, is the further you're away from adult supervision, the more likely the things are going to go wrong. And so if you think about the card holder tapping their card on a POS terminal over here, and the vendor 4 systems back over here, if it was just the bank, perhaps, given their offering with no other assistance, then it's probably a much more controlled environment. But of course, that's not the case. So you have this sort of situation where you have to police quite heavily to ensure that your data strategy is being adhered to and minimise breaches.
Thank you. Alfredo, I'll just press pause. We're past the halfway mark. We've got about 17 minutes left. Questions. Team Charlie, you haven't asked a single question today, so I'm looking at you. We've got one hand here, one hand here. All right, 2 questions. If you could introduce yourself as well, please.
My name's Jay. I'm the General Counsel for PepsiCo APAC. Maybe this is a legal question, maybe it isn't, but I'm really interested in your views. To what extent do you think that all of the data breaches that we see at the moment relate to entities who aren't doing things in as robust a fashion as they should, versus entities who are doing everything they should, but hey, hackers are really smart? And what do you think that means as you sort of wind forward 20 years for privacy? Because as I look at it now, I got to say, as like as a person putting information in various bits and places around the world, you kind of get a sense now that people are starting to think that you know what, no matter what we do, nothing's private. So what do you think? What do you guys think that means for regulation in this space?
I'll start. Feels like a Miss Universe question. Thanks for the tough one.
Yeah.
That's good.
It's a curly one, isn't it?
It is a curly one, but look, a relevant one. I think, and having spoken with counterparts at Medibank and at HWL, and knowing what their systems are, this keeps me awake at night all the time. I think part of the challenge is that human error will always, we are human until we're all replaced by AI and robots. We are human.
Next week.
Next week. Oh, phew, I've only got a week to go. So I've only, it means that human error, and I think speaking hypothetically, the issues we experience ourselves often are as a result of people, clicking on things they shouldn't, no matter how much you train them. Now, so I think in terms of the question, I think it's twofold. I think people are very busy. I think, the hackers are getting smarter, and we're kind of one step behind the game. I feel like, what I was saying before, our data governance framework continues to mould as we do lessons learned, and we try to look forward, but we kind of don't know yet what's going over the hill unless we can pay someone a shitload of money to tell us, who's sitting on the dark side about it. So, combine that with people who are extremely busy doing their jobs every day, in my mind, it's kind of a bit of both. I'm interested to see, at least from the Australian context, where the regulation goes. I know as a public hospital, we're governed by Victorian law, we're governed by the federal legislation, we're now governed by the SOCHI Act because we're critical infrastructure as an emergency department as well, and what's coming. It'll be interesting to see how we adapt to that. But again, it's almost like you're constantly putting more and more regulation on, but is it really addressing the issues that you flagged? Insert word here.
Yeah, can I just quickly respond to that? I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I heard Tim Cook provide his keynote a couple of days ago, and he mentioned that he considers privacy to be a human right. Now, I found that to be quite interesting because I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I'd like to think that I do, and I certainly hope it is, but I don't know if it is, considering that I work with privacy sort of matters every day. What people perhaps think privacy is and what it is in law and what it is across the world in different types of jurisdictions changes and is different. That's a fact. So how Apple attacks privacy, I think, is quite unique. I think it's quite impressive. And I think if all organizations sort of attacked it in that fashion, I think we'd probably have less breaches. But that's an ideal world. To answer your question, I don't know. From my personal experience, I've had both. So, and I've had probably experiences of both. People who try and do the right thing, what Fleur says, but inadvertently have breach because they do something that they shouldn't. And then having the hackers who are incredibly intelligent and good at what they do, penetrate you externally and in sort of cause damage externally with external systems. The reality is moving forward, we're going to continue to have episodes of both, and trying to police it is going to be a matter of trying to get people's alignment on what privacy is, which is almost impossible to do, to be honest. But at the moment, we have the Privacy Act. We have legislation which is coming in, which is going to heavily push rights towards the consumer. If you think of it as a pendulum, it's swinging towards the consumer. It's been swinging towards the consumer in Europe for the last 5-6 years. It will happen here as well. So perhaps that might be the solution. Just give the consumer more power. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really interesting question. I think from my perspective, the analogy that I like to give is, well, let me start off by saying I think everyone needs to approach privacy with it's not if, it's when, and that's where you start off. And then the next piece that I'll add to that is, I like to use this analogy that right now it might be sufficient to guard your house with, a fence and a locked door. But over time, what's reasonable in terms of the type of security that you implement for data breaches that might not be your fault, but that you might be exposed to because of a hacker that spends most of their time trying to break through your walls. It might be more reasonable to have an automated AI dog at the front yard, and that's what might be reasonable in another 20 years' time. So I think it's about being alive to what is reasonable now, and that is unfortunately a changing goalpost that needs to be evaluated, quite frequently. If you think about, quantum computing that's coming out quite soon, what's that going to do to the cybersecurity space? How is it going to become more probable that these data breaches, from a hacker standpoint, are just going to be more frequent, and we're all just going to have to be okay with it? It's unfortunately a moving goalpost, and I think the best you can do is document what reasonable is for you. Have a good governance process that says, this is why we think it's reasonable for now, and hopefully the OAIC, after reviewing the very thorough process that you've got in place, we'll see that you're compliant. But that's how I'd approach it.
Thanks, Alfredo. We've got 2 more questions here. So Tin first, and then Simone.
Tin, legal counsel for Next Payment, fintech sector. So, today, these days, we are seeing a lot of these overlapping regulation and legislation. We have this ISO 27001, APRA standard CP 230 coming into effect next year, July. We got this in the payment service sector. We got this consumer data right accreditation. And in addition, we have GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. In addition, we got ethics regulatory guide. So how do you, my concern is overlapping nature of regulation and legislation. How do you streamline it, and how do you minimize the overlapping nature of those legislation and regulation when you write an in-house information and security policy? How do you do that? I find it really challenging, really kind of like crazy amount of information, right? So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, so I might take it. Yeah, so I completely sympathise with that. PCI DSS, which is a payment standard that payment organisations have to adhere to if you were to accept credit cards, is exhaustive enough, let alone to have all these other sort of pieces of legislation. So I completely sympathise with that situation. It's basically my job, and it's not easy to do. For me, my main goal is to try and align the business as to what we're doing, and we have 3 main ways of making money and 3 business units, and so some of those legislation applies to some of those and some doesn't. So it's an education thing for me personally, to be honest. This is why I run my alignment series, because you're right, there are different pieces of legislation, and not everyone in the business is going to know what they are. So it's a matter of, or I find it a responsibility of mine to ensure, especially when it comes to the merchant acquiring piece, which is perhaps where you'll find yourself in, is to understand what legislation applies to them, PCI DSS being basically one of the main ones. APRA standards don't apply to that side of the business, but they do to others. And so it's understanding what your business is, how you make money, and where you can sort of step in or out of the square, to be honest. But it's incredibly difficult to do, so I sympathise with that. Yeah.
I've had the pleasure / misfortune of having to be in a company that started off just in Australia and then expanded to just over 30 countries and jurisdictions in 3 years. So what I can tell you is I lost a lot of hair. I had a lot more hair than this. I would have rivaled Fleur today. But here I am, slightly balding. But in all seriousness, the best way, the most logical way that I approached compliance through multiple overlapping legislation is I just tried to find the biggest, baddest bully in the playground. I found what the toughest bit of regulation was, and I tried to create an internal policy around that piece of legislation. So if I take privacy, for example, I looked at the GDPR, and that's kind of the gold standard. And so internally, if I track everyone towards that gold standard, effectively we're compliant everywhere else. Outward facing as well, we had to make some business calls around, do we promise that same level of compliance everywhere else? And the rationale around that was, we're a smaller entity. We don't have the ability to run everything in business units geographically. So we ended up making the call to say, yes, we'd promise that we'd have that bigger, broader compliance. And that naturally just, you have to do what you say, otherwise you're in ACL land, and that's a problem. So that was kind of the approach that we took. Now, it also depends on the type of business that you run to. Like if you're a massive organisation, then you can probably afford to run everything in silos geographically. But just, I think the best approach for us was making a call on making everyone track towards that, the tougher compliance, and hoping that people read your data breach response plan at some point.
Hi, Simone from JobAdder here. So, quick question. We have a fairly conservative stance on privacy just given our product, but we're a fairly small fish when it comes to like the suppliers of ours, and some of them, so some of our technology inputs may have a different risk position, right? But we're not in a position to negotiate. We don't have much leverage, and the business is like, well, we need an AWS or we need whatever the input is, right? Is that just a case of saying, fine, well, you're accepting a risk position that's higher than our general appetite, or do you guys have strategies for dealing with those bigger fish when they might not align with your strategy? Thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a reality that I often face, right? And the commercial pressures, perhaps, that you sort of have to adhere to, compromise positions that you may take internally. And as a business, unfortunately, your strategy may very well be dictated by others purely because of that reality. And that's not something that you can probably manage or perhaps even have a lot of power over. And it's just the nature of the beast, really. I can appreciate that happening. And it's great when you have a strategy that you want to adhere to, but with AWS and Azure and Google Cloud, I mean, they're platforms that are sort of going to dictate a lot of the things that you do or don't do, if you want to use them or not. Certainly for us, it is that way. So ultimately, you're going to have to balance or make a judgment call on how much you adhere to your values as a business, and whether or not you have risk appetite to accept others.
Can I just add as well, I think a useful tool for me is actually quantifying the risk. So when we actually translate risk into numbers and sums, I think it also sings a different tune altogether. So that would be something that I'd consider.
The only thing I'd add to that is the due diligence, which I know the previous panel spoke about as well in the context of the tech contracts, especially with the big hitters. We undertake a lot of due diligence. Back in the day, we could just say, oh, we're public sector, so government's telling us, so you have to do what we say. No one listens to that anymore, unfortunately. So, it's kind of You do your risk assessment, you quantify it, you do your due diligence to determine how big of a risk it is. But yes, ultimately, these big players make the world go round, so you either want to get on their bus or you get off.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll only state the obvious by adding the fact that, you know, in situations, you know, unfortunately, you just have to either toe the line or, you know, just accept what's being put in front of you. You know, I certainly felt that in a smaller organisation where I came from a bigger organisation. It's like, surely they'll accept these reasonable changes. No, not so much. So I think the other thing is you learn pretty quickly how to you know, implement, you know, mitigation strategies on how to deal with things on a case-by-case basis, and you just hope that those case-by-case basis things don't become the norm, and you just try and contain it as best you can. I think that's probably what I do.
Brilliant. We've got 2 minutes left, so maybe Alfredo, if I can ask you to perhaps close us out with your, you know, top piece of advice on how to develop a strategy that works.
Yeah. So I've now had the benefit of going into a situation where a data strategy was already there, and then you have to kind of maneuver through legacy issues, etc., and had the benefit of creating my own through the learnings of, through various learnings, good and bad. And I have to say, each one has its own challenges, but I think in hindsight, the thing that I would do in either of those scenarios is going grassroots as quickly as you can. You know, starting off with, you know, really starting off with the fundamentals and understanding, you know, just data mapping, for example, done properly. You start to understand the risk profile pretty quickly. And, you know, I know it's easier said than done when you start an organization. It's like, do I have the time to be data mapping? You know, it's a thing that provides so much value because you really can isolate where the risk is. Then you can start to compartmentalize it, and you can start to figure out really easy ways to deal with, you know, data breaches, for example. Can you contain something to an AWS instance that resides here in Australia? Can you, you know, do we need this data? Why do we have this data? And those questions start helping you think through whether or not the current data strategy is even fit for purpose, or helps you formulate one to begin with. So I think that that's the advice that I think I would give everyone, and I myself have not taken that advice in the past and suffered for it, so I hope that no one else has to go through it like I did. And the other piece is, and something that we didn't get an opportunity to talk about here, was sometimes things are broke anyway. So always, even if you've implemented something, have a process where you're always checking through and measuring your strategy. What is it there for? Is it doing what it needs to do? And even if it's not, evaluate it. Can it be better? In what ways can it be better? Have some kind of a process where you're always measuring your data strategy and make sure that it's tracking in the right direction. I'll close with that.
Brilliant. Please give them a big round of applause. Alfredo, Flor, Alejandro, and Jamie. That was fantastic. So something's happening which has never happened before at any of the other 8 summits we've done. We're actually ahead of time. And so, but it's because of something. So whoever can tell me why they think we're ahead of time wins a prize. The clue lies in the agenda, so you can have a look. Anyway, before we begin the next session and while we're setting up, I just wanted to check in with everyone. How you feeling? Lunch was okay? Decent? Better than last year? Same as last year? Better than last year? Okay, very good, very good. I'll give the feedback to the catering team. Sahil. So Sahil, who runs the catering team, and by the way, get his card because he books out pretty quickly. He's also a lawyer. So he works at LawPath, who you may have come across, and he runs this catering company called Chit Chat. So, you know, very, very keen and very happy to have him on board. He's also catering tomorrow, and it's Mexican food, as I mentioned, so do come back. But before we begin, I also wanted to say, we have that sort of challenge going on, right? So if you post something on LinkedIn and you know, tag Law Ninjas and the photo is good, you get a prize. I haven't seen many posts so far from the people in this room. I've seen more from people watching on the live stream. So do post, use the photo booth. The photo booth is there for a reason. And do tag Law Ninjas and you'll win lots of prizes, including Nando's vouchers tomorrow, some hit vouchers. We've also got Essilor Luxottica glasses. You know the guys who make sunglasses? Yeah, we've got some pretty nice sunglasses coming in tomorrow as well. All right, without further ado, I think we can start our next panel, which is the one right before the drinks break. So if you're looking for alcohol, you just have to wait 40 minutes and then you will get some. And the panel is called How to Promote Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. Our moderator is Elizabeth Flett, General Counsel and Company Secretary at Cancer Council, New South Wales. Our panelists are Claire Wilmot, former Head of Law, Compliance and Patents, Australia and New Zealand at Bayer. Jessica Cunning, General Counsel at Titles Queensland. Niti Nadaraja, freelance GC, DEI consultant and coach. And then Philip Evangelou, Managing Partner, Open Legal. Please welcome them to the stage. Excellent. So again, if you have any questions about DEI, or if your company has a DEI policy that you have concerns about, feel free to ask those questions at the midpoint and at the end of this session. But without further ado, Liz, over to you. Yep.
Thank you. It's really great to be here speaking about this important topic, and joined by four amazing panelists. So I will let each of you give a brief overview beyond Rohan's brilliant introduction. This topic is one that I think has a few different angles to it for in-house lawyers. We are people who hold a unique position in the company that we work for, both as advisors whose role it is to help guard against risk, and also as the recipients of the DEI framework, actions, policies that are in place. We're also human beings with our own unique lived experiences and perspectives, and I think that's a good sort of lead into what we want to share today. So my first question for the panel is, what would you say is the role of the in-house counsel in promoting DEI across an organisation? Jessica or Claire? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll pick this one up and try and bring it back to the audience, given that we're probably all lawyers working in an organisation. We probably have a unique perspective in organisations. Often if you're working in IT or in operations, or there might be some other parts of the business that have that really bird's eye view that we have in the legal team. But I think the unique perspective that we have as lawyers is that we often get to deal with all parts of the business. So we understand and get to see and deal with a lot of the people in the business. Some teams may never get to deal with another particular team. So we really have that unique opportunity. I think as lawyers too, one of our skill sets should be advocacy, and DEI really requires some tough conversations sometimes and some advocacy. So we can really lean on those skills as lawyers. I think the other thing too, just let me have a quick check. I think Philip talks about this a lot, is that knowledge of legal obligations that we have in the broader framework, and bringing that back to the human experience that we get to deal with, so we can kind of blend that strategic leadership with the background that's sort of grounded in law.
Yeah, I think the role of general counsel is really to ensure that the company is complying with the law, obviously, but really making sure that whatever policies in place are actually implemented from a top-down approach, so at the executive level, because it's really important that the executive team lead the way for DEI, because, as you know, they act as a role model for the rest of the organisation, and if the leaders aren't acting and behaving in a way that is conducive to inclusion and diversity, then unfortunately the employees basically follow suit and behave in a similar non-inclusive way. So it really is a top-down approach, and it's up to General Counsel to ensure that the executive team are the role models that they need to be in the organisation.
I think beyond that as well, actually prioritising it, prioritising the measures, not just sort of living the values. But yeah, that's a really good point. Niti?
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple of things. So firstly, I think from my perspective as a DEI consultant, one of the things I firmly believe is that diversity, equity, inclusion is everyone's responsibility in an organisation. When we have organisations which are immature in DEI, that's when I think we start to say DEI is this person's responsibility or that person's responsibility. It really is a collective responsibility on everyone. But I think as in-house counsel, a couple of the things that are unique to us is, I think, picking up on the point around the knowledge of the law, we also have an understanding of the nuances that attach to spaces such as discrimination laws, microaggressions, etc., things like that. So I think, you know, when we're in rooms like talent discussions or, you know, other conversations about employees, it's far easier sometimes for us to pick up some of those nuances around when things are bordering on bias or microaggressions as well. And I think then there is a responsibility on anyone in the room, but I think, you know, given we have that knowledge, I think there is a responsibility to call it out in that moment as well. So I think that's one point. And the other point I would raise that's really important, I mean, I talk to a lot of law firms about their DEI efforts, and sometimes, you know, what they say to me is, well, we're a service provider, and so we're handcuffed by what our in-house counsel are, you know, requiring us to do. So, you know, we can't necessarily do X, Y, Z because, well, it depends. You know, someone gives us instructions late on a Friday, then they give us instructions late on a Friday. So I think there's a role for us to play as in-house counsel in how we provide instructions to external counsel and really thinking about the implications of that from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective for the legal profession as a whole. Because I think we can play a really pivotal role in changing the shape of what our profession looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of that point, and I think that, you know, we have the unique opportunity to be a part of the change that we want to see in the profession as well. A lot of in-house lawyers have come from private practice and would like to right some of the wrongs that we've seen. So great point. And Claire?
I think that's great. I think the other role of an in-house lawyer is actually just to be a leader. So to Phil's point about the executive team, a lot of us actually sit on that executive team. And so it's to lead the change as a cultural change from the top.
Yeah, really great point. And I think as well, let's not overlook the fact that this is an opportunity for leadership, particularly to those who in an in-house legal team might want to start building on their management skills and demonstrating leadership qualities. I think that this is a great space to become more involved in and not just sit back and let your HR team deal with it, even if they are quite active in you know, promoting and managing this space. So I think we have a great role to play. My next question for the panel is, what are some important considerations to keep in mind when building your DEI policy framework?
Look, for me, there's probably two main ones. The first one is ensuring you've got the right people at the table. So both those that are directly impacted, but also really importantly, those that are indirectly impacted, not just for who it's essentially meant to benefit. And the second one, and look, this is a sin from a prior life, I certainly did, it's don't making assumptions. I remember we had another spinal guy actually, returning to Bayer, and I was on the diversity and inclusion for his return to work, and we spent a lot of company resources, like we like to, a lot of company resources on making sure he had the best AT equipment and a desk that went up and down, and he had special controlled heating and aircon for his temperature control. And Steve was his name. Steve essentially came in and the AT equipment didn't work for him or was completely unnecessary. He just used voice control. And where we positioned him didn't have enough room to get around. So there's a lot of things about just don't make assumptions, just actually ask the question, what do you actually want? What do you actually need?
It's such a simple human approach, isn't it? And I think that that's what is forgotten in all of this, is to take a human-centred approach to interacting with people and understanding the issues that impact them. Brilliant.
I might just add to that human approach. I think it's really important too when we're looking at the mix of people that are in our kind of DEI committee space, whatever you want to call it, that can be a burden too. Often for a lot of people in smaller organisations, that's in addition to our day job. I have that experience where I'm General Counsel, Company Secretary and Chair of the DEI committee in my spare time, all the spare time that I have. You know, and it is often a burden that falls on the people that are at the greatest risk of inequity. So it really calls for, to Claire's point, the people that don't benefit from it, the allies, and in fact, DEI benefits all of us. Equity is about all people in an organisation. It's really about everyone stepping up to carry the load from time to time in that DEI space, not just kind of the same people over and over again.
And just to throw out a cheesy, Instagram style quote, but a rising tide really does lift all boats. And I think that's the one thing that I think is important to keep in mind with this. It's not just about the people who are most at risk of, being discriminated against and forgotten about. It's about everybody playing a role in this space. Yeah, Niti?
I was going to add as well, policies are great, just like training is great. But policies and training only do so much in this space. In fact, I've been reading this book, and it was talking about some of the efforts in the States early on, I think in the 70s or 80s or something. And it was talking about how when DEI programs were first introduced in companies, actually things went backwards for a period of time. So representation went backwards. And it's interesting when you look at stats like that to try and understand what it was that led to representation going backwards. And sometimes if you have policies and training and you do nothing with them beyond having a piece of paper or beyond sticking people in a room for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, however much time it might be, then actually sometimes people become blind to discrimination, bias, etc., because people feel, well, we've done what we needed to do, tick. We're there now, we don't need to do anything else. And so I think one thing that's really critical with anything in this space is how is it that we're actually going to make this come to life? What is the cultural change that we need to put in place to make this happen? And a really, I guess, perfect example of this in recent times is parental leave. More and more companies are obviously giving more parental leave to fathers now, and so it's becoming more equal. But what I see as someone who coaches in the parental leave space quite regularly is that often the men that are coming into those coaching sessions are saying, well, I'd love to take my entire parental leave entitlement, but I'm actually being pressured not to. Or the company culture is such that it doesn't actually encourage me to take my entire leave. Or I'm encouraged to only take it in certain ways, which mean that actually I'm not really getting leave because I might be only taking Fridays off, and maybe that means I'm just making up for the Friday the rest of the week or working on the weekend instead. And so we're actually not achieving what we're seeking out to achieve with those policies in the first place because the cultural change hasn't occurred. So I think the conversations that are occurring at a leadership level are really important, but then how are those conversations filtering through the organisation? What's the follow-up with the policy? Because having a policy or training, and it's the first question I ask when someone says they want to do training, it's the first question I ask, why? And what do you hope to achieve with it? Because if you're just doing training or you're just putting a policy on paper, it's not going to achieve a hell of a lot.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. It's all about the implementation, the practical implementation of a framework that really matters in an organisation. You could have the best diversity, equity, inclusion policy in the world, but if it's not actively and proactively being implemented, it's just basically a piece of paper that is being waved around to show, oh, look, we comply. But that sense of belonging is is a basic human need, and if people don't feel like they belong in an organisation, they're going to leave. It's just plain and simple. That's what organisations need to focus on.
And I think it can do more harm than good, really, can't it? When you've got these policies and people who are not willing to act upon them or don't actually understand what it means and how to live those values. I think perhaps in some ways it's a form of sort of microaggression in and of itself. Yeah, so great points. I think, you've each sort of touched on exactly that point. So I'm going to go to the how. So how do you ensure that your DEI measures will be effective, and where might we see it go wrong? Niti, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So how could it go wrong? So many different ways. But in terms of how can you get it right, I think one of the first things to understand is, why are you seeking to do what you're doing? Because I think what often happens in this space is that we go, oh, this looks really nice, we'll do this. And then it seems like everyone's doing this, so we'll add this on as well. And then we'll do this over here and that over here. And all of a sudden the company has 10 things that they're doing which have no connection to one another, and there's no underlying strategy behind it. There's no way to measure whether these things are actually achieving anything for the organisation. And then we start wondering whether we're doing the right thing or not doing the right things for the organisation. So I think really articulating what is it we're seeking to achieve when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and not just using them as buzzwords, because often, they can be buzzwords, they can be quite vague. So really understanding, why are we doing what we're doing? How are we going to measure success? Are we meeting the needs of the people in the organisation? I think they're really critical things, as well as not trying to bite off too much as well. So understanding what we're trying to do, but also really breaking it down, because sometimes in this space, the small things can be just as impactful as the really big things.
And Claire, I know you want to speak to this point as well.
Yes, just following on from what Neve said, I completely agree. I think we need to avoid aspirational targets and really just try and break it down to SMART goals where you can. So, for example, you could have for reconciliation, you could aim to have a RAP. You could choose as an organisation, well, what type of meetings, how many types of meetings? Do we do an acknowledgement to lands and people? What do we do to celebrate NIDAC Week? Break down actually achievable targets that you can get to the end of your quarter or year and say, yes, we've done that. Otherwise, as to your point, it tends to be buzzwords, a lot of talk, a lot of chatter, rather than actually having a plan people can achieve. The other thing I'd go on to say is, and this comes back to Jessica's point as well, particularly for those involved in the work, ideally as organisations, we go one step further, and it becomes a part of people's even performance. In want of a better word, it becomes a part of their daily being within an organisation. And that's where you really see your SMART goals kick into gear, and the organisation actually making achievable progress forward.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Jess, and then I'll interrupt it later.
Yeah, I was just going to bring it back to, I think, for anyone who was here in that first session talking about sort of tech and how we implement tech. One of the first steps that the panel talked about was looking at the problem we're solving, and I think DEI is very much the same way. To sum up what Claire and Nidhi are saying is that I think sometimes we put the cart before the horse, and we really need to sit down and go, well, as a business, in our particular business, what is it that we're trying to solve by putting this in place, and sit down and map that out and plan that out, and that will actually come into actions and tangible goals that we can do, rather than just sort of putting a policy in place thinking we're solving some problem without actually defining that problem to start with.
And before you continue on, I just wanted to make the point as well about effective communication and making sure that the business as a whole understands what is being done and why, and communicate those values so that it is sort of that message across the whole organisation.
Oh, thank you. We're kind of almost at the halfway mark, but I actually just wanted to highlight that I've been getting a lot of WhatsApp messages about this session. Some of the quotes are rockstar panel, so rockstar panel right up there. Also, one question I've got is people would love, and a lot of people are watching via live stream, a lot of them would love to hear your particular specific stories about why you're passionate about DEI. So for example, Philip, you and I spoke a few days ago. I know your story, but people in the room don't. Claire, I know your story, but people in the room don't. So we'd love to hear a bit more from you, and I'll add a bit more time to the panel so that we can do that. So maybe Phil, you can take us first, yeah.
Sure, thanks Rowan. So I want to give an example where DEI went terribly wrong. I was working in an organisation where there was no DEI policy and there was no education and training on that. And I was working in a startup, so they had limited resources. And the manager that I was working under was a stereotypical bully. He was about 6'4", triple my size. And one day I was having a conversation with his partner, and she asked me, "Do you think he's punching above his weight?" And we were having a bit of a joke, and I said yes. The night progressed, and there was drinking and alcohol, and his girlfriend decided to tell him that I said that. And on the way back to the hotel, this is more of a bullying story, but it evolves. The manager turned around, looked at me right in the eye, and just punched me in the chest without any warning. And I couldn't breathe for a good 30 seconds. And he said to me, "Looks like you can't punch above your weight, mister," and then walked off. Then that evolved into him finding out that I was actually gay and using that as a way to harass me and discriminate against me in the workplace on various levels. And it got to the point where I had no choice but to speak up. But what I want to say to Claire's point about assumptions is he assumed that I was comfortable with my sexuality at that point in my life, but in actual fact I wasn't. I grew up in a conservative Greek Orthodox family, and I was an altar boy, and I was basically hiding my sexuality until I was 29, and I didn't feel comfortable coming out in my professional workplace, and that was my choice. But this bully took it upon himself to basically use that to make me feel like I should be ashamed for being gay. And all I can say is that I'm proud that I did stand up for myself, and I'm now grateful to that perpetrator, because if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have gone on to start my own law firm called Open Legal, which has a logo which represents diversity and inclusion. There's 5 different colours on there, and it's a circle, which represents inclusion. So in retrospect, that experience is why I'm passionate about this area, and I'm on a mission to eliminate it in every workplace.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for sharing.
Jess, maybe if you could tell us in your own words.
Way to put me on the spot. But I'll take a leap out of Philip's book with a bit of courage. I actually transitioned as a lawyer, a relatively senior lawyer in my 30s, so I have quite a unique experience in the law. I don't see a lot of people in the world, and even in my community, that look like me, let alone in my office or in this room, to be quite frank. Why do I do what I do? I know what it feels like. DEI is about thoughts and feelings, and if I can do something to make someone else's life a little bit easier and sit on a panel and make an organisation think about their DEI policy more deeply and how that looks at gender transitioning, or how we are more inclusive of parents and parental leave, then I think I'd take my experience and all of the things that I've been through, and I look at that as a strength, and I sort of see that as my superpower, and I can go forth with that and just try and make the world a bit more of an equitable place.
Thank you, Jess. Neeti, you were obviously GC at a few companies. Now you're a DEI consultant and a coach. What makes you passionate about DEI?
Yeah, so I've answered this question actually a few times in the last few weeks for some reason. It seems to keep coming up. But the first thing that comes up for me is actually a story from when I was a law student, not actually working in the law. So I was a cocky 20-year-old law student, went with my dad to VCAT. We've got Indian cultural heritage, and we were sitting in this VCAT tribunal. My parents had a dispute about their renovation or something. I'd read all their contracts, told my dad what was what, all the rest of it. And we went into VCAT, and I hadn't taken the oath because I was like, my dad could speak. He'd been out of India for, 30, 40 years, whatever. So he was speaking, and the guy that was presiding over the tribunal, started talking to my dad in the most condescending manner possible. Like everything was, do you understand? And everything was really slow, and I was sitting there, I was like, I can't deal with this anymore. This is really annoying me. And so I was like, I'm sorry, I'd like to take the oath now, please. Please come and let me speak now. And so I started speaking, and what was fascinating to me was that the same guy treated me very differently to the way he treated my dad. And it was at that point, because until then, I'd had arguments with my dad about there not being racism in Australia, right? Also very naive 20-year-old. And at that moment, I was like, actually, I now understand where my dad's coming from and what his experience must have been like and what the experience of so many other people is like in this country. And I realised at that moment that I have certain privileges that even my parents don't have, despite us looking similar. Despite him being a man, despite me being a woman, I have the privileges of having an Australian/British accent. I have the privilege of having an Australian education. I have the privilege of having a legal education in this country. And so for me, that was the moment where I realised, actually, I have privileges that I can do something with. Now, I then went down the track of going down the corporate law firm life and, going in-house. And I did still continue to do DEI work in-house, but then it all came up again during COVID. And it was when the whole George Floyd incident happened. And I was sitting there and I remember thinking, I donate money to organisations, but it's kind of set and forget. Like it just comes out of my bank account and I'm not really doing anything. And I could be doing more with the privileges that I have. And so that for me was the start of really my journey into completely changing my entire life and going into the business world, which I'd never had any plans to do ever. I never thought I would be an entrepreneur in my life. But all of a sudden I went, actually, no, I need to do something with these privileges that I do have because I can help other people. And so I started helping an organisation that was working in the racial equity/gender equity intersection on a pro bono basis. Didn't want any accolades or anything, so I was like, you don't need to mention me or anything. I don't need my organisation to know that I'm doing anything on the side. I just want to help in whatever way I can. And the more I did that, the more it became something that actually just filled my cup. And, along the way, I've become a parent and had gender bias as well thrown at me and various other things. So there were other things in the mix as well. But for me, it was really that sort of journey from being a 20-year-old and seeing how my dad was treated at VCAT to, then having that realisation later on in life that actually I need to do more.
Thank you. Claire, please.
So mine's probably a slightly different story. I was previously worked in law firms in both Australia and New York. And then I was general counsel at Roche Pharmaceuticals, and then I was formerly general counsel at Bayer, which has a number of different entities from agriculture right through to pharmaceuticals as well. So probably one of the youngest female executives for a role like that at the time. Didn't have a lot of sleep, but had a very, for want of a better word, high-powered job, flying internationally and locally. Married with 3 young kids, and to be fair, thought I was doing a wonderful job. Thought I was doing a great job for diversity and inclusion. I was one of the executive team leaders in that regard. And then one day we're at a family get together and I rode a flying fox and I hit a tree and life changed. And when you have something like that happen, your life perspective changes. So, 10 months later, I left hospital. I was ventilated on a ventilator for about 7 or 8 weeks. Told you'll never eat again, told you'll never drink again, told you'll never talk again. Learned how to talk, got off a ventilator. Still don't have any use to any limbs on my body, which changes life dramatically. Still have this 3 young small children, that did not change. Life is still busy, life is still full of soccer matches. So I took a different perspective on my life and I said, well, what did I do previously that I could do better? What can I do that is purposeful? What can I do for, not that, creating very tight data agreements is not important, it is extremely important. Make sure they're great. But what can I do for my children going forward? And after a lot of time, thought about writing children's books in the space, because there's not a lot of them around diversity and inclusion. Then realised that I can't actually write very well, so did not write children's books, and moved into this space. And then from a different perspective, and realised that there was so much on the other side that I didn't even think of, and I didn't even think to ask. So that's where I'm at. And before I probably wasn't touching a lot of it, and now of course I am.
Thank you so much.
I just want to say that this really is a rockstar panel.
Yeah.
And can we have another applause for the panel and for their courage in sharing their stories? Well done. Now, I don't know if you're looking to me as moderator or to share why I'm
Liz,
here.
we want to hear from you as well.
But I'll share why I'm here. Firstly, when you're presented with the opportunity to moderate a panel like this, why wouldn't you? So, it's been a privilege to get to know and speak with each of the panelists here. I suppose from my perspective, my first thought was, who am I to sort of speak on this issue, or to be able to moderate a panel, of this calibre on an issue like this. But, it doesn't take much for me with my experience. This is child number 3, and I have experienced gender bias, discrimination as a breastfeeding mother in a workplace. And for me, I suppose the importance of inclusion has been very obvious to me and pronounced, and it's something that I have used to inform the way that I want to operate in my own practice, how I want to lead my team, how I want to approach others in my workplace, and looking for opportunities to champion and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion wherever I can. And I think the takeaway message there is, we can all do our part. I think most people will have encountered either first or second hand some form of discrimination or behaviour in a workplace setting that doesn't sit right and isn't acceptable, that isn't aligned with good practices, and whether that be not in accordance with the law or with just being a decent human being. And I think we can all do more. So I'm really proud to moderate this panel, and thank you for the privilege.
Thank you, Liz. I completely forgot about the question and answer bit. So we have about 7 minutes left. So maybe let's see how many questions we have. But does anyone have any questions about DEI or about our speakers or anything that you may be going through? If you'd like to share your story, thank you.
First of all, I just want to say what an amazing panel you are. And I've been trying to I just think you're incredible. Sorry, that's really embarrassing.
Don't cry, otherwise we'll all cry up here too.
Sorry. And I actually wanted to ask you just a very practical question, and how to articulate it clearly. I've been struggling to sort of work out how to say it. So I think it's great that government lead the way in championing diversity and inclusion, and I've noticed that a lot of government procurement contracts are starting to include requirements for vendors to have a diverse slate of employees, particularly with a focus on Indigenous staff. I'm curious to know how, just from a practical perspective, either from you or from people in the audience, how you've successfully navigated that requirement when sometimes it's quite hard to find candidates who, you know, otherwise meet, oh God, it sounds so terrible. Sorry, it's just a really practical challenge we've got, right, to try and sort of build that diverse slate across, you know, across all verticals. I mean, I think we've done a great job in many other respects, but particularly in the Indigenous space, I think we've had a challenge, and I just wondered if anyone had sort of found the answer. Sorry, I hope that question's okay. It is a challenge we've got, and I'm curious to know how to overcome it.
I might jump in.
Thanks.
I don't think there is really a right or wrong answer. It's going to be fit for purpose for each business. I think it's important if we're looking in the recruitment space and attracting talent, particularly when we're looking at writing job ads, for example. They're often written to a very key targeted audience by the same person who looks and thinks the same is writing it. So I think it's really important that the DEI lens be placed on those job ads. Express is better than implied, actually talking about what your organisation does and who you're looking to attract and how you think and feel about certain things doesn't hurt.
Yeah, similar to that point. I don't know how many people in the room have read the book Invisible Women, which has in it this great story about the Philharmonic Orchestra, I think in New York, if I'm not wrong. Anyway, it was an orchestra. And they talk about how they, back in the 60s or 70s, had a real issue with gender balance in the orchestra, and they decided to change things up and do blind auditions. Nothing changed. Went back to the drawing table. This doesn't make any sense. If you start with the assumption that merit is equally distributed amongst the genders, there must be women who are good enough to be in the orchestra. Why are we not getting them into the orchestra? And then they realised that what was happening was that you could hear people's shoes as they walked onto the stage. And so unconsciously there was a bias that was happening in people's minds when people were walking onto stage. So they got people to remove their shoes, and all of a sudden everything changed, and suddenly they had gender balance in the orchestra. Now, it's a really telling example of just how subtle and just how unconscious these biases can really be. And so I think, you know, job ads, absolutely, but also, you know, what do your recruitment panels look like? Who's in the panel? Like, I have this discussion with people all the time. And it's not just about gender. It's not just about creating a balance of gender, because you could have a man and a woman, but, you know, they could come from the same socioeconomic background, have lived all their life in Australia, they could both be a similar age, and they're going to have a lot of affinity bias with each other. They're going to, you know, attract or be attracted to similar people. And so when you're thinking about your, you know, who's in the room interviewing people, think carefully about how similar are the people in the room that are doing the interviewing. I think that's really key. And don't just think about gender, absolutely. But I think on the flip side, and this is something I'm seeing more often nowadays, is, and this doesn't quite answer your question, but it's kind of a problem with some of these requirements sometimes, is we can almost go the opposite way, where we get so hung up on getting a particular type of person into a role that we start to create more of a problem. Because by doing that, then we almost feed the argument that this person only got the role because they're fill in the gaps, right? And sometimes also what we're seeing is, you know, even say in the gender space, sometimes I'm hearing that, you know, women are being tapped on the shoulder to just apply for a job, just so that there's balance in the pool of candidates that are going into the interview. Now that's not great in and of itself if it's only to fill the pool, right? If there's no intention of ever hiring that person, or that person will be good enough to get the role, you can almost do more damage than good at that time. And sometimes people are then being put into roles where they're almost set up to fail because they're not ready. They might not think they're ready for the role as well, but they're being pressured to apply for the role because, hey, we need a woman in the role, or we need this person or that person in the role with a certain diverse dimension. So I think we've got to be a little bit careful, and I know government requirements are different. I mean, I'm working for a government agency right now, so I know what you're talking about. But sometimes I think we've got to be careful with how we look at these policies internally as well, because we can do more damage with them sometimes.
I might just quickly add one small suggestion which may assist in helping the future of Indigenous career trajectories. Could be that, for example, a mentor from the leadership team, the executive leadership team, could be appointed to an Indigenous employee and actually foster them and take them on a path towards becoming a leader themselves. And once we see Indigenous people in leadership positions, that's when we're going to get equality and equity in that sector.
Some really great points, and I think it comes back to that message of diversity, equity and inclusion needing to be woven into the fabric of the organisation and not just expecting it to show up by making an effort in one discrete part. You know, the other aspect is we can go and recruit people, you know, from a diverse group, and yet we don't have a safe and inclusive environment for them to stay in, and so retention becomes a problem. You know, you set yourself up for other issues and create an unsafe working environment. So I think it's important that, again, you know, we look at all the points that the panelists have made today. So with 24 seconds left.
I was just going to say, any more questions? Because I know this is a really important topic and it's something that's very close to my heart as well. Any questions or comments? Oh, two, okay. Team Charlie, represent. Okay, we'll come to you soon. You could introduce yourself.
Thanks, Rowan. I'm Dawny from UTS. I just had a question or a comment first, which is, it seems like there's at least a level of awareness which is increasing about the strength in diversity within organisations, so there's more acknowledgement of that. But just looking to the future, where do you see this going, and hope for the future, I suppose, something optimistic. Also, just an incredible panel and very moving. Thank you for the vulnerability and courage.
I might jump in just because I like talking about this topic so much. When we were preparing, actually, I had to say, please tell me to shut up at a point in time, because I could keep talking about this forever. Look, I think we're at a really interesting time at the moment. Like, if you look at what's happening in the States, for example, there's a lot of A, DEI fatigue, and B, there's a lot of animosity and a lot of aggression around the DEI space at the moment from all angles. And I think this is part of what's a big problem at the moment. The DEI space is full of conversation that is heated, and sometimes I think people are talking to themselves. So like a change management model where you've got people that are like the early adopters, sometimes we're only talking to the people who've already adopted it, like the people who already believe that DEI is a good thing and that we should be doing stuff in this space. And so I do have some very big concerns around where diversity, equity, inclusion is going from that perspective, because I think the language needs to change. I think, empathy has come up a few times today in different panel discussions, but I think this is something that needs to feed into this space more. I think we need to start listening to each other, because what we're doing at the moment in these conversations quite often is talking to brick walls. Someone says something, it's like, oh, we need to do this, we need to do this. The person on the other side of the wall isn't listening because they don't believe it. And diversity, equity, inclusion is it's a very personal and sensitive topic, and the reason there is so much backlash is because often when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion to people, you're hitting on people's sense of self. And so whether it's from a status perspective, that they believe that it's a zero-sum game, if someone's going to win then I'm going to lose, right? That's the whole, why should I bother applying for a job if I'm a white man, because the woman's going to get it. That's a status-related issue that some people are dealing with. Then there can be merit. well, if I believe in DEI being a real thing, then that means that I didn't get the job on my merit. I got it because I'm part of a group that's had advantages. Or then there can be a moral issue for people, right, where they go, well, if I believe in this and I'm part of the group that's been advantaged, then how does that sit with my moral compass? Like, that doesn't sit right with me. And so I think with some of these discussions around DEI, we have to understand that people do have these very personal things that they'll be grappling with themselves, and we have to lean into that and have a conversation that meets people where they're at as well. And I think at the moment we're not doing that in this space, which is why I think we're seeing a lot of division, particularly in the States, but it's everywhere. And you know, you're seeing it across the world. And so yeah, I do believe that has to change if we're going to see more progress in this space.
Thanks. Yeah, Claire.
You're on, yeah. Just going to say, and maybe I'm a bit rose-coloured glasses, but I like to be. Look, I've got 3-year-old triplet nephews and nieces, and they'll come up and they'll be like, Auntie Claire, how do you move that? Auntie Claire, what's that? Auntie Claire, why can't you go swimming with us? Auntie Claire, and they just ask and they ask and they ask and they ask, and they point the obvious out all the time. It's fabulous in a terrible way. Auntie Claire, why can't you touch that when you're itchy? Yeah, pain, I get it, it's annoying. And I think just the normalisation, it's not having assumptions for, you know, we're obviously literally a very diverse panel, which is fabulous. And I'm sure we've all come against assumptions of various kinds. And my hope for the future in D&I is it just becomes a normalisation. It doesn't become a thing. And that's what I'd really like to see. So that may not sit with the aggression in the States, but that's my hope for going forward.
I love that. I'm an eternal optimist and I fully support that hope as well. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you. One more question. Okay, we've got it covered. Liz, maybe if you could close us out before drinks, just with one key piece of advice or one key comment about the topic.
Oh, no pressure. Yeah, and I think what a great job these panelists have done. From my perspective, you know, we can all take some steps to create the change that we want to see in our organisations and in the profession, and I would encourage all of you to do that. And if there's anything that you don't know, I think the first point that was made is ask. We have people with deep knowledge and expertise around us, but so many resources to go and educate ourselves. That's where I'll leave it, and I'll thank the fantastic panel here, Claire, Nitty, Jess, and Philip. Thank you.
Big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. That was amazing. All right, it's the Axiom drinks break. So we've got drinks. The bar's just here. Grab a drink. We've got about 15 minutes, and then grab another drink and come back to your seat. And we'll do the last sessions. The last couple of sessions are on cyber. So I know you've all got, you know, organizations that could be subject to or you know, susceptible to cyber issues. So please do listen in because it's going to be really, really interesting.